Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We'll begin with news on the CCP virus and how the US continues to break records. Although they've made a massive effort towards the production of some sort of vaccine, they also have good reason for that. This week they've reached a new record for daily cases. They're now getting more than 100,000 positive results a day. This is not only a significant increase on the previous week, but it's also going to have implications for their medical services too. People will be hospitalized. Simply by virtue of the number of people who are infected, you are going to see a surge in the number of serious infections. The more severe the infection, the more likely they are to need support, whether that is simply hospitalization for fluids, medical care and so on, or intensive care with ventilators. There's going to be an increase. This is prospectively that second wave that's been spoken of. You can see that in the graph here. You had the early wave, there seems to have been a mid wave, and now this second significant increase. Many days are well above the rolling 7-day average. What is more alarming in many respects is that we're not seeing quite the same rate of hospitalization yet. And that means either more people are dying early on, in which case there's already been a far too high rate of attrition, or alternatively, we're seeing changes in the virus. The best case scenario is that hospitals have found better ways to handle patients who have been infected, and as a consequence, because they're better able to handle the infection, the attrition rate or mortality rate has decreased significantly. Next, we need to look at the possibility that many states, at least in America, are significantly undercounting their number of CCP virus infections. The gold standard of a sort for this is known as PCR. That is a nucleic or genetic test for the virus. This will tell you whether or not the viral genome is present, and theoretically the only way it should be present is if there is an infection or a recent infection, and there is a corresponding value to each of these. With time and the industry available, we have other tests. These include what are known as antigen tests. This is there something in the body, such as a swab, that can react to a known antibody to the virus? If so, this is a positive case. The problem is, of the 50 states in America, not all recognize these antigen tests as reliable enough to add to their daily tally. These states are going directly against guidance by the CDC that says daily reporting should be based on both PCR and antigen testing. For this reason, there are at least 7 states that don't add this number to their count. Another 6 states add it, but keep it as a separate value. This means the remainder, which is what counts for most of the current states with a high rate of infection, have actually managed to include all of the data available. This incomplete data is really important. Knowing who has it definitively, or at least strongly suspected based on antigen testing, helps to identify who could be an asymptomatic carrier. This gives us both the confirmed cases and also leaves a very large gap where we have probable cases. Another significant complication of these antigen-based tests is that the places currently providing them, such as nursing homes and schools, often either have significant delays or do not at all report the results to health authorities. This means that it can be significant retrospective increases to numbers based on the delayed reporting from these facilities. It also means that in some cases, the government may not be made aware of outbreaks at all, especially in asymptomatic carriers. This is important when we're talking about school-based data, where, as we've previously mentioned, while children are less likely to be infected, they can become infected, and this is important for our next bit of news. The issue about household infection rates. If a child picks up the CCP virus at school, That's one issue. They're most likely to be relatively asymptomatic. But the issue is how many people at home will get sick. Research would show that nearly half of the household, if not more, would become infected within days of an asymptomatic carrier like a child. The study by the CDC, although not perfect as it relies on self-reported data, had significant findings. The first of these is that on day 0, 191 of 191 people involved in the study identified that they had no symptoms despite someone in their household reporting a positive diagnosis. In the follow-up of this, 102 of the 191 people reported positive symptoms. That's a 53% infection rate. The infection rate varied depending on how old the person was. If they were between 18 and 57, they had a significantly higher infection rate than if they were under 18. If they were under 18, they had about a 43% chance of being infected. In the words of one of the researchers involved with this, substantial transmission occurred whether the index patient was an adult or a child. Many of the people involved in this study also were asymptomatic when they were first diagnosed. This means that those who are asymptomatic can be significant vectors for infection. And this is where we come into a case study. There was a CCP virus patient who was asymptomatic but also was shedding the virus for 70 days. Consider how long the current outbreak of the CCP virus has been going on. Imagine if someone infected in the early days could shed their version of the virus for 70 days. This would explain some of the widespread increases we are seeing. It's worth noting that in this particular case study, the patient was unusual. First of all, they were a female, which statistically is slightly less likely than being a male, but overall not a big factor. The second is more important. They had leukemia. Leukemia is a blood-based cell issue, often affecting the bone marrow. This can have implications for the immune system and may explain why viral shedding occurred for so long. Consider just how many cases of the CCP virus have been diagnosed in a given day. At the moment, it's over 100,000. Consider that in America, there is a massive number of people who could be, theoretically, more prone to infection and have a compromised immune system. This means that there is a large pool of people who could be asymptomatic and continue to shed the virus for months after the initial infection. This patient's infection is distinct from others, well, particularly where we're talking about what they're testing for. In many cases, someone who's been infected with the CCP virus may be shedding viral particles, which is distinct from the virus itself. Viral particles can still test positive, but they're not able to cause infection. This patient was shedding enough of the virus where they could have established new infections over such a long period. Now that we have suitably disappointed everybody, let's move on to some interesting news that's good news for once. Technology and particularly genetic research has been showing ways to re-establish damaged parts of the body. This has been everything from regrowing whole limbs to very specific organs. One of the reasons this is so important is our ability to provide real prosthetics, not something man-made or artificial, but a living tissue and organ-based replacement for something that has been damaged. That's great for those who have originally had a functioning part of their body lost. In other cases, parts of the body can be damaged either through birth and inherited defects, or something that's occurred throughout their life, such as damage from mutations in their genome. This in some cases can lead to very specific disorders, one of these being blindness. Blindness can be caused by damage to the optic nerve. This is where research into regenerative medicine comes in. Specifically, the ability to regrow the optic nerve for mice based in a lab. Like nearly all nerves in the adult body, they cannot be regrown and replaced, unlike skin and other tissue. This means that once they're damaged permanently, and if they're damaged beyond use, you lose use of whatever they are attached to. In the case of the optic nerve, that is the eyes, or at least one of them. Being able to repair and or replace them is a huge step forward for eye-based injuries. One of the big ones that this is going to apply to is glaucoma. The way this research works is that the scientists were able to inject a very small signal in the form of a gene therapy into the mice eye. From here, it caused the production of something called protrudin. Protrudin helped the regeneration of the optic nerve. At the end of the experiment, the mice who were given the gene therapy had better nerve production for their eyes than the control group did. The advantages to this therapy are that the delivery mechanism, an injection in the eye, are already used for other things. This means the only thing that they need to be able to prove is effective is the gene therapy itself. This will help with eye-based injuries, but it also has promise in other areas, particularly injuries to the spine, which is also full of nerves. Now on to another case study, but this time even more bizarre and interesting. Most people understand that you can have a mild allergic reaction to cold air, particularly if you are asthmatic. In this case, a man had that sort of reaction after having a shower. The Colorado man, who was 34 years old, collapsed after he got out of a hot shower into a cold bathroom. Not only did he have breathing issues, but he was also covered in hives. This is a whole body allergic reaction. After being rushed to the hospital, they confirmed that he had a very rare and unusual disease. This disease is known as cold urticaria, this being an allergic reaction to exposure to cold environments, whether that's cold air, water, or even food. Some studies have indicated that could be as common as 0.05% of the population. Although that was a weird and bizarre story, we now need to look at an even more weird and bizarre phenomena. This phenomena is known as the platypus. The platypus is an Australian animal, and it is a weird one at that. Well, most of Australia is weird actually. Anyway, the platypus itself was historically not recognized as an animal. It was thought to be an ongoing prank. It had a beaver's tail, a duck's bill, a furry body, webbed feet, poisonous claws. It could sense with a sort of sonar. It laid eggs but also lactated. It had a bizarre jumble of different features that belonged to different families of animals. And now we get to add yet one more to this. The platypus fluoresces under ultraviolet light. Research into this stems from finding many other animals across the world that also happen to be fluorescent. Other research has concluded that it's either used for communication or sexual reproduction. What is unusual in the platypus is that both the male and female appear to fluoresce in a similar way. This would indicate that it isn't a sexually dimorphic trait. Going now to Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan Navy and a large number of volunteers have had to just go to a massive effort to save 120 whales that were stranded on a beach. Whales have, for an unknown reason, been beaching themselves for as long as humans can tell. The issue with this is that whales need to be kept wet and cool. If not, they overheat and or dehydrate and die. As you can imagine, once you get an incredibly large, heavy whale on a beach, covered in sand, it's a very hard thing to get them back in the water. Imagine trying to push a bus that has been beached on a beach back into the water. That's what's happening with these whales, and there were 120 of them. Fortunately, they were able to get nearly all 110 of them back into the water, with only 2 dying, and they appear to have died due to injuries sustained when they became beached. While still in that part of the world, we should look to India, where a bizarre find has been made. An almost butter yellow turtle. Not just the shell, but the limbs and head as well. The animal has been found by the Indian Forest Service, or at least publicly announced and become an internet phenomena via the Indian Forest Service. The turtle itself is specifically an Indian flapshell turtle, which are normally brown with yellow spots. Their underside is normally meant to be a white, but this turtle is all over yellow, and a very bright yellow at that. The phenomena appears to be a variation on albinism, rather than being pure white with pink or red eyes. The yellow pigmentation will survive in these turtles, which, relatively obviously, leads to their coloration. The condition itself is not incredibly rare in that we rarely ever see examples, but reports are limited, with very few but widespread reporting in everywhere from Nepal down through Myanmar and further. As we mentioned with other examples of odd animals, the colorations they have is a problem. Being such an obvious, vibrant color in an environment that is otherwise dull and dreary, often drab green and grey, maybe even a bit of brown. It means that the bright, yellow, almost golden coloration of this turtle makes it a prized specimen for any predator, and very easily found. Going now from bizarre animals and phenomena of that kind, we can look at more plant-based and microscopic discoveries, specifically how fungal colonies can support trees. You may or may not know about the symbiotic relationship between certain fungi and big trees. For example, certain trees such as oak will require the support of their own fungi in order to thrive, and when transplanted, it's best to move soil from the original location to the new location to provide the tree with that support. This is not just true of oak. Many other species exhibit a similar phenomena. For example, truffles require certain trees to survive, and in turn they provide a degree of support. This is where Canadian research comes in. They were looking at the Douglas fir, which is a particular tree from British Columbia in Canada. They would look at where the fungi were sending their roots, and they would look at where the tree would grow. The short summary of their research is that the more connected the tree was with the fungi, the more growth it would put on. This is an interesting finding. To start with, if you're looking at forestry and you're trying to get more timber from fewer trees, this could be a significant bonus. If we're looking at it from an environmental point of view, for example, carbon sequestering, having more trees growing more quickly would in theory store away more carbon. Finally, we're going to go to even more weird news, and for that we need to go to space. SpaceX wants to set up its own legal system for its Mars-based colony. As you can imagine, being so far from Earth, they don't see much point in following Earth-based law. As dystopian and fictional as this sounds, that's exactly what SpaceX has come out with recently. They intend to do so by setting up a constitution. And, on top of this, they're also looking to set up their terms of service for the Starlink service. This is the satellite internet company which has been somewhat controversial recently. On the Mars side of things, it's going to be a lot harder than just creating a constitution. The colony itself would need to be recognized internationally, and that's where things are going to get very difficult very quickly. There are many states in the world currently that are not recognized, Taiwan being a good example. If it's not recognized as its own independent place, then it can't be recognized legally. If it's not recognized legally, the laws of this other colony could well prove to be a problem. As it stands now, based on the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, those people who leave Earth go to wherever they are going with their national identity from Earth. This means an American on Mars is still an American, similar to someone from China, Russia, or India, other spacefaring nations. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have below.